Welcome to the Final Girls podcast, where we all float down here. I'm Anna Bogutska, co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. Recently just come back from Cannes, so still getting over it. I hope you've had a chance to listen to the Dispatch recap episode that I recorded about the genre or genre-adjacent movies that have been screening at this year's Cannes Film Festival. It's a slightly new format for me for this podcast. If it works, let me know and I can look into making more of those. With that said, if you're new to the show, first of all, welcome. We are finalizing, covering the last handful of films of this fourth series of the show, where we're looking at teen horror movies in depth, really stretching the definition of what makes a teen horror movie and exploring why teenagers make for such compelling protagonists and often villains of the genre. Today's double bill, although you could also argue that it is not in fact a double bill and just one movie split into two movies, is the first big screen adaptation of Stephen King's It, both directed by Andy Muschietti. It Chapter 1 came out in 2017, followed a few years later in 2019 by It Chapter 2, and it is essentially, and as you'll hear in the episode, one story, but that for obvious reasons had to be split into two. The book, for anyone who's not read it, is over 1,000 pages long, and it's an incredibly sprawling story about a group of teenagers or near teenagers who have to tackle as Luke, my guest in this episode, calls him, a fear chameleon, mostly remembered as Pennywise the Clown. And joining me in this episode is regular guest, It superfan, and exquisite broadcaster and writer Louise Blaine. A quick reminder, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Final Girls UK, and if you can spare a few seconds of your day to leave us a little review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts, I would deeply appreciate that. And as usual, please note that we will be spoiling everything about the films, both of them, pretty much from the very beginning, so do keep that in mind if you're spoiler averse. With all of that said, please enjoy our deep dive into It. Hi, Louise. Welcome back. Welcome to Derry.
Anna. Oh gosh, oh no, the nightmares will begin. Dear me, if we're in Derry already. I thought we'd maybe have, just some nice chat first, but no, welcome to Derry. Bring your own balloons.
Oh my god. But they can only be red.
Only red balloons.
I am really tired for this. Also, so listeners know, I've just come back from Cannes the night before we're recording this. I watched these two movies, rewatched them just before leaving. Mm-hmm. And occasionally walking down the Croisette, everything was lit up red. And I swear to you, it was a very long walk from kind of the main part of Cannes where the screenings are happening to the apartment where I was staying. And I kept thinking, if a red balloon pops up just randomly from under the bridge from one of the beaches, I will throw myself into the sea. I'm like, I'm not fucking around with Pennywise. Like, absolutely not.
That would be it. No, literally it. Oh, it's like, before we even get into it, like these movies, for better or worse, are full of some of the most brilliantly horrific imaginative imagery, like that just sticks in your head. Like, it is, I mean, for what people say about them, and I will really go into it, like, these are objectively scary things from people that clearly love to scare the shit out of you. And the fact that their base material is a book that I absolutely adore from literally the master of horror means every layer of it is baked in fear.
And also it's extremely noticeable how much love there is from both the Andy and Barbara Muschietti, the director and the producer of both It's, that there is a deep love and understanding for the world of Stephen King too, and the world of It in particular, because we might touch on the book a little bit, but it is a weird and ambitious and cosmically complicated book.
Yep.
Very strange book to adapt. But we'll talk about how well. I think we both agree that they did it quite well.
Yeah, they did. They really did. And I love it. I mean, I read it every couple of years.
Do you?
I love it so much. Because it's weird comfort reading for me. Apart from the end, obviously, which there's numerous jokes about. I find it really comforting because it is so that the friendships in it, and I love the cutting between the past and the future and the past. I love the way that Stephen King does that, and it's actually very filmic the way he writes it. But yeah, I love it, and I don't know why, and I think it's it's the kind of the childhood nostalgia and the purity of the good moments and the sheer nightmares of the bad, I think are just perfect. So it's weird. It's the only book that I go back to repeatedly.
So this kind of leads into, the first question that I wanted to throw out. And it's, what is your relationship with Stephen King?
Can I just make a little heart shape with my hands? I can't do that very well on a podcast, can I?
No, but if you can describe it, I can almost see you do it.
Yeah, I am doing it. I love the books of Stephen King. I've talked on a number of different podcasts at length about how much I love Stephen King, because there is a very specific, actually quite cozy Stephen King tone, which, despite all of its horror, has proper heart. And I think it's something that obviously something like very current, like Stranger Things, has taken an awful lot from, is this idea of these idealistic childhood summers. They always feel the same. So many of his characters are writers. They all kind of fit into the same world. And even when he kind of goes fantastical in Dark Tower, which I'm not massively big on, I much prefer his horror, I still feel like he has this sort of central beating heart that good will eventually prevail in a world of horror.
And there's also I'm a really big Stephen King fan as well. He was very much my entryway into adult horror fiction, after you graduate from Goosebumps, after you graduate from R.L. Stein
and point horror.
Yeah, and
absolutely.
And Christopher Pike, you beeline for Stephen King, which is literally what I did when I was finally allowed into the grown-up section of the library.
Yes, me too. Although, did you ever stray into Richard Lehman territory?
No, I did not. I did not. I was aware.
It was packed with sex.
Oh,
absolutely. God. Literally, it would be a case of the characters would be in a horrific situation and they would just fuck. And obviously, I was like 14 reading this and going, this is tremendously exciting, but I'm not sure is quite correct.
You know what? I think because I was reading a lot of really weird fiction, not as in like weird as a descriptor, but the subgenre of weird fiction.
Yeah.
And, you could call some of Stephen King's work weird fiction in its own right, even it potentially. But that thing that you mentioned before, kind of the heart of it, the anchoring of it in such a specific and, because of pop culture, because of cinema, such a recognizable experience, which is fundamentally American, but feels global.
Yeah.
Kind of makes it a lot more accessible for people than just the high weird shit that's out there. Totally. When I was reading Stephen King as a kid, like I remember the first book I read was Pet Sematary and I was about 9. I think that all the sex stuff really went above my head. Like I read it and I kind of understood what it was, but I didn't really understand what it was. So I think the Richard Lehman stuff, I was just like, I don't think there's not enough horror here. I'm not into it.
It was not okay.
No.
It wasn't okay. There's a reason that Richard Lehman is no longer a discussion point and potentially was never one, but because he had such cool covers of like, they're kind of brightly coloured, like fun house type covers, and you were like, oh, I want that horror. Like it looks like Sweet Shop horror. And then you'd read it and go, no, this is not Sweet Shop horror.
And okay, so we're both Stephen King fans, and I'm really intrigued by the fact that it is your comfort book. And before we really dive into the film, kind of what do you think is at the heart of the book that makes it both kind of very difficult to adapt, even though it's been adapted twice for the screen, for TV and for film, the ones that we're going to talk about. But it is one of those King texts that should be impenetrable. It's over 1,000 pages long. It is very sprawling. It's very ambitious and has a very, people forget about this, but it's essentially cosmic horror at the end of it. What is the beating heart of it that you think kind of makes it one of King's biggest titles?
Despite the fact that everyone goes on and on about the clown, I think a lot of people don't really understand that the heart of the fear of it is that it's a fear chameleon that fits to your fears, which means the other side of that is human, and it's about the relationships. So it is about the Losers Club in both the past and the present, and they are such magnificent characters and their interactions, and I think we wouldn't be able to almost take on the cosmic horror if it wasn't for them. And I think I've been through a progression with the book, because it used to be I must have first read it when I was a teenager, I didn't like there was sort of the interludes, which were all the histories of Derry, which were really quite dense and away from the characters, and they would really go into the past and all the things that had ever happened in the town, which actually now I find just as fascinating, because it means that Derry exists in a world of which all of the horrific stuff happens, and there's some really interesting cosmic horror in there, and really interesting character interactions, and the building of a city of absolute doom, basically. And it actually only enhances the rest of the book. But obviously when you're younger, you're like, oh, I just want to go with the characters where they're having fun together. But I think that's why you can keep going back to it and keep feeling the humanity of it in this cosmically horrific world, which happens to have a scary clown as one of the faces of its many-headed nastiness, I guess.
I mean, the book and the films themselves as well, I think but the book specifically, because, you know, it's created in the imagination of the reader, is in its own way a chameleon of fear, right? Because if you read it as a teenager, you identify with the younger version of the characters. As you said, you skip over all the world building, but the idea of a city that is seeped in malice and seeped in evil, and is this hotbed, this hotspot where evil will always show its head and rear its head, and will essentially infect all the citizens of it, whether they leave or whether they stay in Derry, is a fascinating concept. And it's like kind of there in the foreground of the book and of the film as well. But it's not the thing that people latch onto, because it's a bit more abstract than just a scary clown who wants to eat children. Yeah,
and it's something that these movies actually managed to really touch on. Like there's the scene where Ben is on the bridge and Belch is trying to draw on his stomach.
Yeah.
And a car drives past with grown-ups in it. And in the ideal world, grown-ups will save you. And they just look and they go past, and obviously, just to accentuate the point, a red balloon arrives in the back of the car. But it doesn't actually need to, because it creates a world of, I think this is another thing it does. When it's in the childhood sections, it does that thing of adults are just in the periphery. They're not really involved. It is a child's world. And I think the powerlessness of that is, well, the grown-ups won't help us. And I think that's a really good universal sort of horror idea, is the kids need to save the day because the grown-ups don't listen.
Before, I want to ask about the moment in time when the adaptation of it came out, but before that, can you, and we will be, you know, for the listeners, we will be essentially, I think at this point, it's been a few years since both the films came out. I think it's one cohesive story that is presented over two very long films.
Yes, it is.
So we're just going to talk about it as one cohesive story, you know, as if it were one 5-hour-long film.
And I think that's actually, with having just watched them both together as a 5-hour-long film, how it should have been. And I think actually, and I actually have kind of changed my attitude to chapter 2 since I watched them both together. Because you get a clearer, so wanky as it sounds, the vision of what Andy Muschietti was trying to do, you actually get much clearer when you put them together. And obviously they shot the second one 2 years after. They had to digitally de-age the actors. Like,
very funny.
They had to, because kids are kids, and that's the problem. If you don't get your funding for 2 movies, you're going to have to do this. And I do think that they managed to actually, you know, pull it off in a way. But I do think it should have been an 8-hour, and there obviously is coming a TV series. I do think it should have been an 8-hour series.
I kind of agree. I mean, I actually think that it's for the ambitions of adapting this book in particular. I'm almost baffled that they didn't do it as a miniseries, but at the same time I'm kind of glad, because what it did, and, you know, well, I'm gonna hold that thought and come back to it after we kind of set the scene for what it is, just to remind people of what it is, because the fact that it was a movie, I think, is actually a very, very important decision. And I also rewatched a couple of weeks ago, back to back, kind of fully, one after another in one day, and experiencing the whole thing as the whole story, as opposed to, watching one on a big screen and then 2 years later watching the next one.
That's it.
It's a completely different, it takes on a completely different shape, I think.
Totally. Yep. Like a chameleon itself, Anna. Yes. How strange.
Oh my god.
It's almost like there's a theme.
Oh, it's almost like they also put it out 27 years after the last It adaptation. Oh. So for anyone who's not rewatched the 2 It movies over 5 hours like we did, can you please summarize the story of It briefly before we dig into it?
So it is set over chapter 1, chapter 2 is set in the 1980s, which was actually moved from the original 1950s of the Stephen King book. And it is about 6 they're the outsiders who come together. They become the Losers Club, these kids, and they kind of uncover what has been lurking in Derry for a long time, which is an evil that arrives every 27 years and basically kills children and hunts people and basically just swallows them up and then disappears. So it's set in the 80s, and then it's also set in the present day, when it turns out they didn't kill it the first time around and they've come back and they're now grown-ups and they're having to remember their past and still tackle this horrific thing that morphs itself into their greatest fears.
Beautiful. You're so good at summaries.
Thanks. I was just gazing at my Haunted Mansion Lego and being like, please keep talking. You're going the right way. I'm sure this is right.
So I kind of alluded to this earlier, but I want to talk about the adaptation of it a little bit and the choice to adapt it as a movie and what that kind of the moment at which it came. Because the first It part chapter 1, which is the one with the kids primarily, came out in 2017. It chapter 2 comes out in 2019. So we've talked a little bit about the book, but what is the anticipation for adapting the most sprawling and very culturally beloved Stephen King book, but one that has only had one small screen, very low budget, very heavily censored miniseries adaptation in 1990? How anticipated and what are the expectations placed on the big screen adaptation of It?
Oh, it was huge. And it wasn't just huge because it was a Stephen King book, so Stephen King fans are finally going, wow, I'm going to get a big screen version of my favourite Stephen King book. It was also the mythology which has been created around the idea of Pennywise. Yes. Tim Curry's Pennywise, obviously in the series, had such almost urban legend, like creepypasta effect on people, because people kind of said, oh, I watched it too young and it was really, really scary and that still gives me nightmares. And
I'm one of those people.
Yeah. And a lot of those people hadn't read it. You know, people they knew it was based, maybe they knew it was based on a Stephen King book, but at the same time, they're afraid of these images of Tim Curry, basically. And all of a sudden, that kind of jars in them because that was what they experienced when they were young. Again, that nostalgia and that fear also plays on the anticipation of what a big screen version is. Because if that's one of your formative fears, and if that's sitting in the back of your head as something you're afraid of, and you're suddenly an adult and you're like, I'm still afraid of that thing. And now it's, 2017, and I am still afraid. And now it's, coming out in the landscape of the Conjurings, the Insidiouses, the Sinisters. We know what modern horror looks like. And if you then suddenly look at that through a lens of, but how does it look now? I think the anticipation is enormous, huge, almost insurmountable. And the fact that the first film does so well, and obviously you'll have the stats there, I assume, but didn't it make literally more money than any horror for years?
It was the highest grossing horror film ever. Actually,
there you go. That's the one.
which was a massive, I think, I wanted to talk a little bit about we'll talk about the landscape of horror in a minute, but I wanted to mention as well the fact that it is it not only because of Pennywise and the cultural impact of that. You know, if anybody's not rewatched the miniseries for a while, it's not good,
No.
but it is very memorable.
Yes.
And I'm not sure if I've ever told the story on this podcast. I probably have elsewhere, but that was an image that I was terrified of well into my 20s. I watched maybe 10 minutes, the first 10 minutes of the adaptation when I was like 9. And I started screaming. And at this point, 9 or 10, and at this point I was already watching horror movies consistently. Yeah. And still something about Tim Curry's Pennywise just absolutely gnawed deep inside of me. And I could not watch it. I closed my eyes, I shut my ears. I would not stop screaming. I was at a friend's house until she put it out, put the VHS in its box, put the box away. And I could not be near it. Like I would be terrified just even with the image of it, the poster of it. It would send shivers down my spine. And I read the book, and it was, it kind of, you know, calmed that fear down because the book is its an entire own being. But the image of Pennywise was so deeply ingrained in my brain. It made the conscious effort when I was in my first or second year of uni, literally 19 or 20, to sit down, all lights on, and watch it. And I had to leave the door open. I had to make sure my flatmate was home. I needed to take all these precautions to watch this miniseries that is really tame. But it was still scary because of that insane way that it burrows its way into your head. So the expectation around it, and I think kind of also it was around the time where Stephen King was getting adapted more and more. Around this time in 2016, 2017. I think this is also roughly the time where I did a BFI season on adaptations of Stephen King works, which was curated by friend and colleague Michael Blythe, and I did a number of events around King as well, and he co-curated he curated a strand of films that was scary for him, which was really fun. But it was the time where people were talking again about Stephen King and movies and TV, and everybody was kind of going back and adapting his work or readapting it. But this was the expectation for this, and I mentioned the fact that it was movies and not TV, even though television and horror TV was already happening quite a lot. Still, there is such a much bigger landscape of possibilities with film, in the sense of just censorship and limitations and scope. And even budget at this point. This is a big budget horror movie. This is big cast, sprawling cast. And because of Stranger Things, I think, there had reignited this imagery of the kids solving something horrific by themselves, which is very from the 80s and kind of 90s, but not so much from the 2000s. But Stranger Things really catapulted kind of that nostalgia back into the mainstream in a big way. And I was really terrified of whether they were going to fuck up the story or not. Yeah. Because they could either choose to tame it, because the book is very explicit, very foul-mouthed. The kids are very, we'll talk about it later, but the kids are kind of nasty in their own way, in a really kid way.
Well, that thing I found really interesting, because obviously, and this is not a plug for it, but you can obviously listen to all 5 episodes of Hello Sydney. I thought on this rewatch that I realised that they have that Kevin Williamson approach to the kids.
Yes.
They are nasty and wicked. And although they are having, a lot of them they're very sweet with each other, they're also not sweet with each other. And also then there's something like, there's a ridiculous number of swears in this. Oh, yeah. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd.
Richie is probably responsible for half of them.
Yeah, at least half. But yeah, I thought about that, and I thought they're wicked children. And that's great. But importantly, they have fears and flaws, and they aren't eventually afraid to talk about those fears and how overwhelming they are. And I think that's what's key, and that's what saves them from being totally objectionable. Because sometimes I do think Finn Wolfhard errs into just, there's slightly too many of those comedy interjections, but I do think the rest of the kids kind of make up for that.
So I think this is a good point for us to talk about the kids mainly. And I just want to preface this as well to say it might be a strange choice to put this in a teen horror series, but I think these kids actually sit perfectly in that cusp between we're not kids anymore, but we're not seen as sort of teenagers, because
Yes.
they also, I'd love to like all the kids, but also they all look quite different. So some of them, people hit puberty at different stages. So some of them look like teenagers, some of them look like 9-year-old kids.
Yeah.
But they're all the same age. They're all hanging out together. They're all desperately trying to be kind of older than they actually are. They're right at that peak stage, like the 12, 13 years where you're like, I want to be a teenager. I don't want to be a kid anymore. So actually, I think for multiple reasons that we'll get into, the It movies, the first chapter in particular, falls very neatly into the teen horror tradition. But it's obviously so much more. So let's talk about the kids themselves, the Losers Club. Bill, Beverly, Mike, Richie, Eddie, Ben, Stanley. Like, what do you make of their dynamic and of them individually and how the film treats them?
I love all of them in their own ways. And I think that was another thing of the anticipation before I watched it. Obviously, by this point, I don't know how many times I'd read it, and I already have those characters pre-built in that horrible bookish way. But I loved them all. I thought they were great. I especially loved the casting of Beverly. Sophie, is it Sophia or Sophie?
Sophia
Ellis.
Sophia Lillis, yeah.
I think from the get-go, she is just electric. I think the first scene of her sitting on that toilet stall and literally there's a lovely shot of her putting her cigarette out on the wall and just looking utterly like not again, where she's simultaneously old and knowing, but also a child.
Yeah.
And I think she's absolutely glowing in that. And she's also, again, in the sequence with the first time they interact and she's signing the yearbook. I think it's the sweetest, loveliest thing. And I genuinely think they're the most amazing introductions to those specific characters. I'm actually mostly in love with all of them. And I love the sweetness of Ben as well, at both ages, actually. But yeah, I really like them.
I really like what you mentioned about Beverly, because she does have that resigned glow of somebody who doesn't know that they're good, because everyone around them in her home and in her school keeps telling her that that she's bad, that there's something wrong with her. I remember in that introduction scene when she's putting out she's putting out a cigarette on someone writing that she's a slut in the bathroom stalls, and it's just this resigned acceptance that I know this isn't me, but this is what they think of me, and I just have to get through it, just power through. It doesn't,
same shit, different day, Luke.
The fight is no longer worth it. And do you think, because we're introduced to the losers individually, and some of them are friends already, and some of them, like Ben and Beverly, are kind of outsiders and are brought into, and Mike, and are brought into the group later on. How do you think kind of they all individually fare before they are connected to one another?
I think it's on rewatch. I do find it. I feel like it started out as a longer film where they had.
Wow.
I feel like, especially with the introductions to them, because obviously they have to fit in who these characters are, but also that they're afraid of things and that they are already being hunted by whatever is there. We see the first time we pretty much see Stanley with that horrific painting creature in that office, and we have to go through these set pieces, and I do feel like it has to somewhat rush these introductions, because but what it thankfully doesn't do is it doesn't just have them all friends initially, because what is so rich about the book is them all finding each other, because finding those friendships is important, and they happen through really sort of random ways. They meet Ben because he's really beaten up because he's being bullied, and it all kind of flows in a sort of fate almost. It would be easy if they were already a unit, but they're not. They have to come together, and that's part of what their power is they find each other and they come together. So I think the film has to actually kind of rush that before they are then friends and then fighting things, and I think there was probably a lot more quieter scenes, I think, that were probably cut from it. So I think it deals fine, but I do feel like it's a bit like, here's a scary thing in this character, here's a scary thing in this character, because it has to get it all in there, and it has to slightly rush, I feel.
It does take a lot of time in presenting what they're afraid of, whether they acknowledge it or not. And the other thing that kind of makes it so, I think, endearing in a way is because when you're growing up, you're afraid of a lot of things, but you don't necessarily want to, can, or have the ability to articulate what it is that you're afraid of in a way that some people, not all people, learn to do when they grow up. Therapy for everyone, please, and thank you.
The therapy, please.
Therapy for everyone. How do you think the film deals when they're kids, preteens, kind of, how do you think the film deals with showing us what they're afraid of?
Oh, I think it does. It does it with big, broad brushstrokes, I think, really. But that's okay, because when you're a kid, sometimes those things are what scares you. I noticed that in the book, Stanley has an interaction because he likes birds. He has a really weird interaction with a giant bird, and I understand why they replaced it with a painting, because I feel like it would have been at the start of that movie. Hitting out with the giant birds would have been a bit early, which is a shame, because genuinely in the book that was terrifying. You know, he ends up hiding in a pipe from a giant sparrow or something, which is amazing and bizarre and surreal and very King. So I think it does it. I think it does a good job of showing their insecurities, and I think that's why it feels all the more powerful when you put them together. I do think that the depictions of those they became very CG. And I do think that lessens it, because if you think about that we haven't even talked about the bloody terrifying and utterly perfect first scene with Georgie.
Yes,
because
we'll get to it.
It is spot on, and the reason that it's spot on is because it's relatively simple, because it is just Skarsgård in a gutter as Pennywise, and he doesn't need to do tremendously. Like, there doesn't need to be any massive CG. It's just this drooling, terrifying thing. But later on in both movies, they're just like, well, we can do this, so we will. And it all just gets a bit, it doesn't have that real feeling. It looks very polished. And I think sometimes that takes away from what is actually base fears or more realistic.
Well, before I get into some of the things that you mentioned, just on the first scene, I think it's so successful for numerous reasons, not just because it's perfectly pitched and directed and just well made, but because, again, it's the first appearance of Pennywise, and it's almost not shot for shot, but it echoes the way that the scene in the miniseries was shot. Yeah. So it instantly kind of conjures up the images of Tim Curry, because we're not yet fully seeing Pennywise, full-bodied, full face even. He's still seen through the drain. So it almost feels like the fear from the 1990 series is peeking back out again. Yeah. The other thing that I think really makes it impactful as a first scene in general is that Georgie dies. Yeah. And children are not supposed to die in movies. It's why My Girl traumatized a whole generation. Yep. Children are not, in general, shouldn't die as kids, but in movies, it's kind of an unspoken thing. We're like, well, the protagonist will never die and the kid will never die, because of course we're going to save the kids, because the idea of us filming a child's death is just a bit too horrific to deal with. Definitely not in our entertainment. So the fact that this film, the story, both the book, miniseries, and these films open with this, and the kid is just so like little Paddington Bear size in his little yellow raincoat, just doing this, again, a very kind of now naive and nostalgic way of playing around by himself, is dead within the first 10 minutes of the film, is a horrific way to start. It just sets you up for, I think, for audiences that are not familiar with King or with it. All these kids are at risk of dying.
Yeah, bets are off. And I also think, like, I remember I wrote in my notes when I was watching that, going, this is just as horrific as it was in fact, I find it more horrific. And it's yes, also because the child dies, but it's like, don't fuck with cats, isn't it? But the suffering shown, it doesn't just go glom. Yeah. It eats his arm, and then he is in his little Paddington Bear yellow jacket on the ground in the rain, dragging himself away from a gutter without an arm and screaming. Now that's really horrific. So not only does a child die, but you watch active horrific suffering while an adult, kind of gazes out the window and just sees the kid playing, doesn't really look out again. And the cat's the one that watches. It is genuinely, it's horrifying. It's really horrifying. And I'm really almost quite glad that while that doesn't really happen again, not like that, because all it had to do was do that once. And all you'll think is this could happen again, this could happen, but thankfully doesn't really, you know, in the same level of absolute suffering.
God. Let's move on from Georgie. I can't handle Georgie until he reappears again in the second one. It's a little zombie it.
Little zombie guy.
Oh dear. God, you're so right. But going back to a couple of points that you mentioned before when talking about kind of the fears and how they're expressed in the film, there's a style that Andy Muschietti has, a style of horror that, you know, you can see a direct through line through his previous film Mama, which also has Jessica Chastain. You know, the very thin, slightly distorted monsters, very much here. But there is a weird balance, I think, that kind of works for me between the CGI'd and jump scary visualization of fears, the big monsters, and then the very, very bloody, kind of not quite body horror, but messy horror.
Yeah, messy.
And I'm thinking specifically of Bev again, and the scene when she is, you know, just the sink in her bathroom erupts with blood and fills everything up.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most effective ones for me because of that, because it's not a monster, it's everything. The space is horrifying to her, being covered in this sludge that she cannot get off, but that nobody else can see.
Yeah. I think so. If we're going for, can we choose our scariest fears moment from the start? So
Let's do it.
Yours? Is that yours?
Yeah, that's mine.
Okay, so as well as I don't really like teeth, the other thing that I really, really don't like is headless things. Is headless things.
Okay.
I have a headless things phobia, and I think it came from watching the cartoon of Sleepy Hollow when I was too young.
Okay.
The Headless Horseman scares the shit out of me. I also love Sleepy Hollow, the Tim Burton version, because it's wonderful. So the scene when Ben is in the library and he's reading about the horrible disaster that was just that was meant to be the lovely Easter hunt at the factory, which then blew up and killed 110 children, blowing a head into a tree. So his scare is literally, there's this little Easter egg there, and then he goes down into the basement of the library, and he is faced with a headless boy. And not only is the headless boy absolutely terrifying, the movement of the boy. So it's this kind of like disjointed, puppet-style, relentless, slightly too fast. It's like the opposite of my fear of sloths. They move too slow, and the headless thing moves too fast. So that to me was just a cacophony of, yes, I understand this is slightly CG'd stuff, but it scares the hell out of me because Muschietti, you're absolutely right, understands the perfect nightmare logic. And that's what he completely hits out with on a regular. You know, his nightmare logic of things being oversized or moving in the wrong way or being sped up or being too just wrong is just, he always gets it spot on. But yeah, that headless scuttle of that child down the rows.
Oh my God. And also, I think that same scuttle, that movement, also applies to Pennywise too. We'll talk about him in a bit, but there is sort of like a shift in almost playback speeds. Like sometimes he's going at 0.7, sometimes he's at 1.1, then sometimes he's like 1.8, and he shifts very quickly between all speeds. I think that's a Muschietti film because he deploys it so much throughout both films, and you never know which one he's gonna go. Is it gonna be a full, shining like bathing of blood? Is it going to be a zombified little child? Is it going to be slow moving? Is it going to be fast moving? Is it going to be a jump scare? Is it going to be like a giant monster that's almost goofy looking? He kind of pulls out all the punches, which I think is, if there were such a thing as a one size fits all horror movie, I'd say it probably is it.
Yeah.
And actually,
something's going to stick.
Yeah,
something will stick.
I actually don't. I think that the best thing about horror movies is the fact that there is something that's individually terrifying for everyone. You just have to kind of find it, even if you can't necessarily articulate it. But it kind of does everything.
Yep. Yeah, and everyone will find a different thing. And again, that's what it's about, is that we are all afraid of different things. And it'll be funny because, you know, some people might look at that sequence and be like, oh, I thought that was just silly. Meanwhile,
this other one,
balloon, you know, like, and suddenly you're like, oh yes, so this is for everyone.
For me, it's actually outside of the scene with Beverly and the blood, because it's also rooted in the fact that she's living with her abusive father. So like there's a real life horror there that informs this. And the thing that's terrifying to me is the fact that he walks in and he doesn't see it.
Yeah,
it's just such a beautiful metaphor, I think, for how she's feeling. But the other ones that I'm mostly terrified of are not really the jump scares. They're the ones where something pops up in the background and doesn't go away.
Yes.
So it's in the library with Ben where he starts seeing the head as he turns the pages. And it's also when they're watching the video, they're projecting the video.
Oh my gosh, the slideshow, Anna.
Oh my god. Oh, I thought it was like in my head it's a video because like it moves up, but you're right, it's a slideshow. And then like Pennywise just starts moving a tiny bit and then it's a little bit quicker and then he leaves the screen. Things pop. I know this isn't gonna happen, but things popping out of the screen is not for me.
No. Not for that me. Again, the idea that you said that was a video is really interesting, isn't it? Because it's that Machete thing, and it's actually it's like a Machete branded like flick book. You know, that's what it is. It's like you want to stop flicking because you're just like, please, I don't want to see what happens next. And that's interesting. You're saying coming out of the screen because I was rewatching Insidious for Mike, and there is a point in that where there's a character. It's already quite horrible. There's a character like walking on a balcony outside. And it's already quite scary because it's a sort of cloaked figure. And then all of a sudden, the next frame is the character is walking inside. So it's that kind of scare of any time you think an evil thing is where it's meant to be, coming even closer, because the next stage of that is it coming out to us. So it's almost like a staged. It's like a teased fourth wall break almost, because it's like, if it can come through that, it can come through this, and you're not safe either. And it's like a base fear that is just so good. It's so good.
And how do you think the second film, which has the adult losers club, bar Stanley, R.I.P., how do you think it replicates or reimagines these very same fears, but now with the characters as adults?
Do you know, I think it actually does really well. I think, again, it is a sequential series of terrifying shorts, which at points, some of which work and some of which don't. But I do think they manage to reharness it every time they come back together, almost. Before, I didn't think it worked at all. Before, I was really sad about Chapter 2. But actually now, having rewatched it and having had negative thoughts about it before, I actually think it's the only way that they could have finished Chapter 1. But I think one thing I have to say is I adore the casting. The casting is absolutely perfect.
It's so perfect. And did you know that the kids actually input into the casting of the adult versions of them? Yeah. Which is why I apparently Finn Wolfhard was like, Bill Hader, please. Bill Hader. What a great choice.
And he got it.
He did. And Bill Hader is the best thing about Chapter 2. Hands down.
Yes, he is. And Jessica Chastain, I love her.
Yeah, she's very good. Her. Yes. Becky Dark, our mutual friend and friend of the pod, absolutely hates her.
Does she?
We'll never forgive her for it.
I didn't know that. I'm going to have to. I was literally texting her last night. What? No. Oh, dear.
She hates Chastain.
Why?
I won't. Listen, I don't get it. I don't get it. No. But maybe we can get Becky Dark's input. I'll ask her to message me a voice note so we can include it here.
Why, Becky? Why? Why?
To off balance the Chastain love. I love Chastain.
Yeah, I love Chastain too.
I know you mentioned it kind of feels like sequential moments, but is there any one particular one as adults that works, or does it feel a little bit too muschetti, too CGI?
Okay, in which case I know you are leading me to the Chastain sequence, which I love the start of, as she arrives at her old house, and it's this old woman sitting there, and you know that it's awful, and you know that it's nasty, and you know that it smells horrific in there, and the light's horrible, and they're sweating and drinking tea that you just wouldn't drink because you don't know where it came from. And then it becomes, there's the weird sequence where she goes in, she's looking at the little postcard from Ben, and I think it's that point where there's just suddenly the woman is naked, and you're like, what the fuck? And that's still scary. But then arrives as a giant elongated CG thing, which I think takes for a moment it does that nightmare transfer as she's trying to desperately escape, but I do think it maybe errs slightly too far into the ludicrous, because up until then it felt very well paced, it felt very, you know, genuinely laced with dread, and I'm not sure that's the punchline for that specific sequence, but I respect it nonetheless.
I actually, this is one of the sequences that I remember liking the most when I first watched it, and I've completely turned on it since my rewatch. Right. Not least because of the, you know, the elongated old lady vibes, which is basically Mama but reimagined.
Yes.
But then also I started thinking, I mean, any stranger in a dingy apartment that is actually your childhood apartment where you used to get abused will be creepy just by association. But there is something, and maybe it's I'm working on something, and maybe I've just like been more attuned to it. So when I watch this, it's like, why is it inherently creepy that it's an old woman? Yeah. Why is it inherently creepy that it's an old woman's body? You know what I mean? Yeah. It's not so much the fact that
problems with X.
Yeah,
come in here.
I think there is like a tendency, and I think Muschietti has kind of done it in his previous work too. But I'm not finger pointing at him. I think it's a trope in horror that old women are creepy by default. So if you have an old woman in a film that is associated with horror, she's got something wrong with her.
Yes.
And that I found, like, suddenly I'm like, why is that scary? Like, that's not necessarily inherently terrifying. I think the house is creepy. Yeah. And the actress does a really good job of playing up the creepy. But the fact that it's the thing that is scary to adult Bev, is a naked old woman.
It's effectively an old woman. Yeah.
Yeah. I just find a bit like, really? Oh, so saggy tits is the fear? That's it?
I think that especially of the CG moment basically just does that. Because it's like, and you're suddenly like, oh, okay, no, just no. Because you're right. That environment is inherently creepy. It looks creepy. It feels creepy. The idea of returning to it is, and I like the suggestion, almost like the past for Pennywise, just like my father was in the circus, and I enjoyed that weird imagery of him kind of hunched over. I don't even know what he was working on before turning around and drooling. There's a whole lot of drooling, really scary drooling from Pennywise. But yeah, there's there are hints of really good stuff, but then it is absolutely it sits in tropes, and then it triples down on that trope with a giant CG elongated fest.
I think there is something, I think Bill Hader is a standout in chapter 2 for multiple reasons, but I think the way that his scene is almost recreating the one that he had as a kid, the Richie experience as a kid, but now because we understand a bit more of Richie as an adult, it takes on another level, because of the thing that I mentioned before, that sometimes when you're kids you can't really articulate the thing you're afraid of, you just know that you're afraid of it for some reason, and then as an adult it gains more meaning and it becomes more entrenched and linked to your personality. And I think the transformation or the fears of Richie have not really changed since he was a kid. And I don't know, when I was rewatching it, like I was very moved by Bill Hader's performance, but I do wish it was I don't know, I wanted more time with him.
Yeah.
Because of that, because I think that the way that he was hiding himself from himself, and that being transformed into a fear, and this one, you know, the figure of the Paul Bunyan massive statue was so coherent from chapter 1 to chapter 2. I was like, I almost wanted a bit more time spent with Richie understanding why this is the thing that he's afraid of.
Yeah, and because it's suggested, isn't it? And again, I bet there was more. I bet there was more shot.
Yeah.
I bet there was more shot because him crying at the end is one of the most moving parts of it, because it's very unmovie-like. Because what tends to happen when everybody gets to the end of a movie is everybody's happy, and it's almost like they've completely forgot that they might have lost a number of their members to get there, and they're like, "Yay, we survived!" But he despairs and cries, and I think he is, for all of his laws, one of the very, very human characters and very, very layered characters. But I also am really glad that they kept that from the book, because again, like the giant bird, that sequence could have been seen as looking quite silly. The idea of a giant statue coming to life, when actually it's one of all of our very base fears is, oh, that's weird because it's oversized and strange. I would hate that to come to life. It's a very childlike fear. But it carries into that second one beautifully.
And there's something that you mentioned right at the start of our conversation about how both the story of it, the book, the movie, deals with memories. And memory, but not nostalgia necessarily. But I wanted to ask, how do you think Chapter 2 in particular calls back to Chapter 1 and deals with the memories of these characters? But especially coming in a point, it's kind of a broad and specific question, coming at a point where nostalgia has become such a go-to mechanism for horror, and of course Stranger Things has a massive impact here. But nostalgia is not necessarily the exploration of memory or what that means for characters or for us as audiences, but that's what Chapter 2 is all about. The characters, they all leave Derry except Mike, who becomes a librarian and the keeper of their shared memories in a way. And he brings them all back, except Stanley, RIP. And what do you think kind of the role of memories, the fact that they lose their memories until they come back to Derry and then have to rediscover them through their fears? How does that play into the horror of what it is?
What can I preface this? I think it's very interesting because structurally, when they made the first movie, they didn't know that they were going to get to make the second movie, but they had to have an idea. They had to have a way that they could have Chapter 2, when actually the book itself is pretty much, it goes back and forth all the time. So you're constantly flipping back and forth. And while the characters have forgotten in the future, and their act of remembering is when we go back in, what they had to do with the structure of these movies was go, well, how are we going to do that? How are we going to have them do that? And they basically had to restructure the narrative so that in the second one, they had to have a reason to go looking for these memories. So they bring up this kind of, we all need to go and find our artifact individually. And it's kind of like suddenly you need to go and get these 6 MacGuffins to come back and beat the thing, right? But those MacGuffins are the memories. And I think that was actually probably the smartest way that they could have addressed such a complex tome that they'd broken in two, not knowing that they'd get to make the second one. So actually, I think that's a very artful use of structure and narrative when King's text is so insurmountable in many ways. So I think they did it, first off, I think they did an amazing job with that. But I did enjoy the idea of gradually remembering your past, because we do remember through items and things. I think the power of your surroundings, we all experience it, and they also touch on it a lot. You know, they go into the library and Bill says, didn't this used to be bigger? And they are the kind of feelings that you get when you return to where you were from, where you were born. And I think having to then explore these places and see what's changed over time, because it's very relatable. You know, you walk down a street that you walked down when you were 10 and it's still the same street, but it's also not. And you'll focus on the tiny things that were the same. And the discovery of obviously Bill finding silver, suddenly he literally touches those handlebars and he is transformed back. And those are the things that we find when, you know, you open a cupboard and you find all your kid stuff, or you find something you loved as a teenager and then you touch it and you feel all those memories. So actually I think it's very, as you say, not nostalgic, and focused instead of the experiences we have as children that we forget until we have to remember, because we can't remember everything. And a lot of the times, if we've been through grief, if we've been through heartbreak, we actually want to purposefully avoid those things because we don't want to feel those feelings again, because it's so overwhelming. And this is basically a series of characters having to forcibly go through that, whether they like it or not, and those results that they find either being positive in some cases, as Beverly remembers how she felt about Bill, or negative in the fact that then we go into these nightmarish thoughts. So I think it's a very deft interplay of memory.
And there is you mentioned nightmare logic before, which is such I think an under-discussed staple of horror films. You know, the whole premise of the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, I'd even argue Hellraiser as a franchise also kind of function on this idea of this doesn't fully make sense, but it makes sense in the worst possible nightmarish situations. I think it's the darker side of dream logic, right? Which can be fabulous and lovely.
Oh, yeah.
And you can jump really high and you can do all sorts of things. And, you know, if you can lucid dream, or you know how to do lucid dreaming, it's amazing.
Yeah.
But there is a sort of a forcedness to nightmare logic where the logic of horror and of nightmares is forced upon you. You can't control it in a way that perhaps you could with lighter dream or lucid dreaming.
Yes.
And I have that sense here a lot, even though it's not, you know, on the surface. I don't think it presents itself as such, but I think Pennywise, I think this might be a good moment for us to move into talking about Pennywise. Pennywise is essentially nightmare logic made flesh.
Yes.
It's really interesting. We've always mentioned Pennywise as a clown. I think, you know, when we started speaking, it is that the cultural impact of Tim Curry's performance. In fact, the cultural impact was so large that the whole kind of paranoia about creepy clowns pretty much started with it.
Totally.
There's a podcast that actually goes into creepy clown sightings, into people being terrified of clowns by default as opposed to being entertained by them. Kind of goes. There's two people that go hand in hand. There's Tim Curry's performance as Pennywise, and there's John Wayne Gacy, the serial killer, who moonlighted as a clown. I'll leave it in the show notes because it's a great podcast. But what is the power of Pennywise? And I mean that not Pennywise the creature and kind of the narrative and the story, but kind of why is he so scary for everyone in different ways?
You mean as that one form of that clown? Or the bit underneath? Because
kind of both.
Yeah, so I think what's particularly... And I like the fact that these movies actually look at those different things, the different things he becomes. Like, I'm not quite sure, as described in the text, the leper for Eddie is a particularly odd one, but something that he's obviously afraid of because he's afraid of germs and disease and all of these things. But I think the reason that I think the podcast that you discussed will obviously go into the fact that it's the conversion of something that should be innocent and should be fun. And the idea of a clown that is evil is inherently troubling because it's the sort of bastardization of what that should actually be, is entertaining and nice and fun and actually not want to kill you and eat your arms. But I think what's underneath that, as the sort of fear chameleon that we're discussing, is the fact that it is universal and he is terrifying. But what I think is interesting, especially about Skarsgård's performance here, is he's sort of animalistic. He starts off playful and he actually has conversations about that he knows your secrets. The poor little girl in chapter 2 that has the birthmark on her face. Oh, God. That's what he preys on. He's like, oh, we can just make that go away. Why would you do that? I've got marks on my face. And he is a relatable monster. He tries to be relatable with them to the point where they're like, oh, maybe this isn't so bad. And that's his playful side before he transforms into the monster that he is. And I hadn't really realized it before, but there's a moment that he always does, which is this kind of, the creature does, is this pause. And almost like he's kind of loading. Like there's just this eerie, utter stillness before transforming into the animalistic monster that just needs to feed on children. So I think that's where the fear lies, is it tries to have a human face, and when it doesn't work as a human face, it will eat you with its layers of teeth.
I think this is where the cosmic horror of it all comes in, right? The Lovecraftian aspect of it, which is perhaps a little bit too high-minded. But as you were speaking, I was remembering the scenes of Pennywise that genuinely scared me, and the ones that are just kind of cool looking. Yeah, and it's the moments of stillness, but it's when he's not really moving very quickly or not moving at all, and he's just there. And he just wants you to know that he's there, because he can be anywhere all at once and in multiple forms. But it's also and I think this is why it is so difficult to describe. I think it's why the story is called It, because it's not a he, it's not Pennywise. Pennywise is the form that has stuck in pop culture the most, but there is an unknowability to it.
Yes.
Which is the scary part. And it's that moment. The films visualize it in different ways, right? He changes. I think what's one of the most successful things about them is that he changes form so many times. But there is this recurring thing that happens that you mentioned, that he just opens up his mouth very wide, like with very many layers of teeth, just huge jaw, drooling all over the place. But that's not necessarily the scary thing to me. The scary thing to me is just a split second before he does.
Yes.
Because I don't know what form he will take.
Yeah.
And I think it's this, the thing about cosmic horror that I love is that the terrifying thing is that we simply cannot comprehend the level of horror that we're about to see. And the thing that kills people, humans, in cosmic horror stories, and why it's so bloody difficult to adapt, is because how do you adapt unknowability into a visual form? Because you have to see it. The only way is to just do it through the fear of the person who's beholding it.
Yeah.
But then that's not necessarily very visually interesting, is it? So it's the split second. For me, it's always a split second with it before we see what it becomes and the form that it takes. Because that's the moment where I'm like, anything that I can imagine it's too much to handle.
Yeah, it's that fear of like the kind of fear that will make your brain unhinge.
Yes.
Like something that is also in Stephen King so much, The Mist,
yes,
for instance. Like the whole, there is entire passages in the novella of The Mist where Stephen King basically explains cosmic horror by saying the creatures that scuttle there, the things that take you to the edge of complete madness because of the sheer scale that your brain literally can't handle all of the potential possibilities that can exist in a world where every horror exists. It's that almost sort of paradox of those things existing simultaneously in your brain and being too scary to exist simultaneously in your brain with you.
Mm-hmm. Exactly that. And it's why The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing, is so affecting. It's because that's an attempt to capture something unknowable, but effectively that film, the horror of that film, is unknowable and unseeable and shifts shapes constantly. So you can never quite grasp it.
Yeah. Physically and literally.
Literally, yeah.
Figuratively. And existentially.
That's a kind of almost a very broad academic approach to the horror of it, but kind of talking specifically about Bill Skarsgård and his performance. What do you make of his... I want to kind of really center it on the physicality of his Pennywise. He does spend most of the time as Pennywise the clown in the film.
Yeah. I love him. I think he's tremendously terrifying. I think from the get-go, I think he's horrific. I think his drooling, which apparently was caused by the teeth, but they kept it in because they were like, yeah, that's weird and scary, and it is weird and scary. Like the fact that he's just constantly like, there's almost it's not like a sort of Rick and Morty style drooling. It's an uncontrolled, almost kind of.
It's almost lustful.
Yeah, and lustful, but also the internal animalistic, sort of the fact that something unnatural is happening. Like he'll try and look like a nice clown, but that's wrong. It's the betrayal of, you mentioned before, he's trying to appear human, like he's wearing a person mask. Yes.
But the drooling betrays him.
Yeah, it's that sneaks out. But yeah, I love I love his performance. I love his physical performance.
Yes.
I also love the comedy of his performance. Like I love the fact that at one point he waves with a dismembered arm.
Yeah, yes.
I think the use of humor in these movies, and there is a lot of humor, especially in the darkness. And I think we need it because, again, along with that, cosmic horror, you need to laugh or you'll probably cry. And there's some really overt things that most people wouldn't laugh at a dismembered arm, but there's a specific tone for good horror that almost kind of errs into Evil Dead territory. Evil Dead 2 territory, in the fact that it's absurd. There's an absurdity to it, yet it is still scary. And I think it actually walks that line very well. And he's a key part of that, because he's a clown. He's a comedic figure, you know, and he manages to entertain and scare on every level.
He's also a ridiculous figure. Like, clowns are meant to, you know, their work is to get people to laugh at them.
Yep.
And so he does these little performances, little jittery performances of a clown, but everything is just slightly off. And I think it's that offness that he actually does very much with his physicality. Even the eyes, like Bill Skarsgård, if anybody's not seen what Bill Skarsgård looks like, he is, if the name does not betray him, part of the Skarsgård clan, which are probably the best looking Swedish men in existence.
He is cheekbones.
He is cheekbones. He is blue eyes, gray hair, like the teen star lips, like all the package. And then he does this, but he has this amazing, very bulbous eyes, and he can do this thing where he can sort of shift one of his eyes so it looks they look in different directions.
Yeah, he really does that, which is mad.
And it's if you Google, he did this a lot on talk shows when the film was coming out and he was doing the press rounds, and it's really uncanny because this very, very like traditionally good looking young Swedish man suddenly will do this weird creepy shit with his face, just with his mouth and his eyes, like literally his eyeballs, and it's uncanny. It's really the domain that Matt has over his face and this role, combined with the design of Pennywise, is kind of the scene in chapter 2, I think, where he appears as himself, as what he looks like, supposedly as Bill Gray.
Yes. And
kind of rips the makeup of Pennywise into his face with his nails. Is truly great.
He is amazing. And also I think the makeup is particularly clever as well, because it's wrong as well. He's got this giant domed head, which is very cracked. And it's just like everything is peeling like some kind of strange mask that is really too old and shouldn't be there. You know, it's been around too long. It's
like he's put makeup on top of last night's makeup, which has already been on top of the previous night's makeup.
Yeah, and no one has ever moisturized.
Ever. Yeah, not a moisturizer in sight in Derry.
No primer.
No serums.
They have never been to Glossier.
But the true form of it, which is probably the most difficult thing to adapt about the book, right? The whole cosmic element of it, the turtle, the deadlights,
yeah.
How do you think, as a constant reader and rereader, how do you think it manages to adapt that in the last part of the film?
To be honest, I almost the turtle, they literally, it's almost like a tacked on thing when they're swimming. They're like, oh, there's a turtle, and it cuts.
Yeah.
Which is clearly just a nod to people who have read the book, because I think they realize that that's a step too far almost. I think they understand that to adapt this, they need to lose some stuff, basically. But I do think the Deadlights, the idea of the Deadlights, I think they actually go quite bold with, because they could easily have just not had them. And I love the depiction of these swirling lights at the end of that long, elongated tunnel of teeth. Like, I love that idea. And then the repeat of it in the second one as it all descends into that little cup thing. I actually think they did the best with what they had, really, for what the story that they were telling. I think they could obviously go deeper, and I bet Andy Muschietti probably wanted to. I bet there was a whole other version sitting there, but at the same time, I do feel like they managed to sort of vanquish that evil without having to explain too much, really. Other than that, I did love the memory sequence for Bill as he was seeing, like, literally it arrive on Earth, which I think you only realise that's what you're watching having if you've read the book, because otherwise that will probably make zero sense, or even less sense.
Yeah, I think so too. I think, I agree. I think they've quite smartly taken out some of the over-explaining of its arrival on Earth, the whole turtle business. And even they don't necessarily explain the Deadlights. In dialogue, they sort of just show the effect, the way that people snap into this paralyzed, hypnotized state where they're floating. I thought was very effective because it's very simple. Don't look into the Deadlights. Otherwise, this is what happens. That's all we need to know as viewers, especially viewers who aren't necessarily seeped in the book mythology or the Stephen King world. But what do you think? And this is kind of, going back to what we're talking about teens and stuff. When they're adults, they're kind of reconnecting with their younger selves. And considering when these films came out, 2017 and 2019, the fact that the 2017 film basically resurrected horror as a successful box office genre, as something that is not, just for festivals, that is making money, that is critically well received. This is already the point where, elevated horror, quote unquote, is doing the rounds. So people are already taking horror seriously, so to speak. But now it's also making bank again.
Yeah.
How do you think this takes from not just Stephen King, but the horror that had come before it? So I'm thinking very specifically about the tropes of teen horror films, and also of newer stuff that was coming around this time, 2007, between 2014 and 2016, when the first film was made.
I think, if I think about it, like, I obviously had recently watched Insidious, and I feel like what Wan was doing, and Wanell, obviously, in the early 2010s, kind of defined an idea that we would have of horror monsters.
Okay.
I feel like it didn't define it. They redefined a sort of idea of what we would expect. So there was the strange demons in Insidious, that strange sort of Darth Maul lipstick demon type thing. And it made it okay that was scary, because, some people would look at it just looks silly. And I think that kind of paved the way for his Andy Muschietti's brand of horror, in the sense that people were quite ready for that kind of thing. And I do, in terms of tropes, people had just seen Stranger Things.
Yep.
And they had just seen Finn Wolfhard in a very, very, very similar role. And I almost think to a detraction, almost, because Stephen King did it first. He did do it first before Stranger Things was a thing. That's where it's from, all that sort of Stand By Me stuff. So actually, I think some people watched it and went, oh, it's just like Stranger Things, when actually it's like, well, no, that's where it came from. And actually the Duffer Brothers, I think, wanted to make it. I'd read. And I think it came at the right time, where people could appreciate the mental idea of the nostalgia of Pennywise, as we've discussed. They'd already seen that, it was okay to go and enjoy a horror film on a Friday night in the cinema. That's acceptable for everybody. And they already have an understanding of, as you say, a teen movie structure. We'd had, now I'm thinking about it, Anna, we'd had Scream 4 in 2011, so people were still watching these things. But I do think, I wanted to say it would give something, and I actually think Chapter 2 gives something far more unique than Chapter 1, because Chapter 1 actually flows quite like, oh, children hunted by a thing, got to beat the thing, beats the thing. When actually the Chapter 2 does something more interesting. It's like, well, you didn't beat the thing, and now you need to tackle your adult demons, or your child demons as an adult, which I actually think is a far more interesting structure, even if it's theme, even if it's wrapped around the MacGuffin-y structure of get the things, go and get your things so we can put them in a pot, So actually, trope-wise and inspiration-wise, Chapter 2 kind of broke the mold a little bit. If that's a long way of... That's probably not even answered your question, Anna.
No, it kind of does, because I've started thinking about Scream, because you brought it up a few times, but Scream and arguably some teen slashers as well that we've discussed here, like the Nightmare on Elm Street, occasionally, way down the line, will send or Halloween will send their characters to re-battle the demon that they thought they had defeated.
Yes. Sequels.
Yes. But we never spend as much time in these films with the characters. We mostly spend them already kind of essentially repeating the thing, but also trying to run away from the same thing in the same way. They're never actually trying to understand themselves and combat the demons within before they can kill the demon that's external. Not to get too hoity, but that's pretty much it. And I think Chapter 2 kind of spends so much time with it. It does. It feels a little bit. It feels a little bit long, but because it needs to really allow every character to dive into their own psychology before they're actually equipped to deal with Pennywise again.
And it almost, by calling it chapter 2, it makes it sound like a sequel when actually it's the whole book.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I do think chapter 2 is trying to say, well, this is the rest of it, but we live in a world of horror sequels. So had people not read the book, and they would have just thought that the first one was the entire book and then they're just trying to cash in with a sequel, when actually, as you say, emotionally, this was actually a book that was effectively ripped in two, and not ripped in two in a nice way. Like literally pages ripped out everywhere and then put in a stack, and then pages elsewhere put in another stack.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they separated what was a cohesive narrative of an exploration of memory, which is what the tome is, into something that effectively looks like a first film and a second film, you know, externally, when actually that's not what it's meant to be. And I think because of that, they can get away with that power. But I do also think it almost feels like a shame that, you know, it's not in the case of these characters, oh, we didn't kill the thing because it's back again for, you know, IP reasons. We don't kill the thing because the thing comes back every 27 years and we have to kill it as adults. You know, it's that difference.
Yeah, but I think that's also quite a smart marketing choice. Because I think with you know, it is, and I think we're living in this world now because of the dominance of the MCU, right? That as much as I'm a big defender of the MCU, but I'm starting to think that the demands on the audiences of pre-knowledge and homework to be done before watching a story has kind of reached a moment of too muchness. It is simply impossible for people to dive into a single story anymore. They need to have pre-built knowledge, which is
not just movies but also TV series and potentially comics. Yeah.
So, and you know, and I've always say this because whether it's an adaptation, comic book movies, or the MCU, whatever, I think the most successful ones are the ones that can function on, you know, for the hardcore fans, for the readers of King, for the readers and rereaders of It. It needs to function for a general but niche audience, so a big niche. So like horror fans, they need to be able to enjoy each movie individually and both as a whole. And C, they needs to function for someone who will casually go into this. It needs to be a cohesive story. So then I completely get it that, so if you're getting nitpicky, it might seem like a kind of a misdirect or a disservice to the story because it is one story. But you can't sell that to two different to the B and C audience, because if someone just wants to see a scary movie, they need to feel like it's finished. And chapter 1 finishes it, and so does chapter 2, and they both kind of function individually, even though they're two split parts of the same story. And, you know, we mentioned before that they didn't know whether they're going to make a part 2 when they started making the first one. So it wasn't a given. So it kind of needed to function. Even if it's half of the story, it still needed to be a whole story. That was a whole big mess of explanation, but I think it kind of makes sense.
Oh, no, it totally does. And I absolutely feel, and I think the way that they did it was the best way that they could have. I mean, they made two cohesive arcing narratives. Like they made them
that are actually also just one story,
that standalone. They made two. It is, I mean, when they were planning it, obviously that was the plan that they had, but the idea of a missing summer, it's ingenious. Like, what did we do when we were all apart? Oh, I don't know, let's find out. And you don't need to have known that there was a missing summer for that second one. But yeah, no, I feel like they did it in the best possible way that they could have.
So what I love, and I mentioned it kind of before, that the film was released 27 years after the other screen adaptation of It. It's just cute. It's really cute. And we mentioned also became the highest grossing horror film of all time. I believe it still is. But to start wrapping up our conversation about it, what do you think about It Chapter 1 in particular landed so much with everyone that it became very critically acclaimed and immensely financially successful?
I was thinking about this last night when I was watching it, going, I'm actually quite surprised it did.
Oh.
I'm not surprised that it did because of what I was watching, but I was surprised when I realized how successful and critically acclaimed it was is almost like a lovely surprise that everybody accepted it. And I think it's everything we've spoken about. I think it is that focus on characters. It's that idea of, you know, that power of the imagery of Pennywise, which hopefully then people realized could be many more scary shapes, complete with completely over the top gruey comedy. I think it's scary, it's funny, it's smart. It feels smart. It never makes you feel like an idiot as a viewer. It does smart things. It has smart talking characters. And it genuinely, as we've kind of rounded up, there is something scary for everyone. It is like an all-you-can-eat buffet of scares. You can just leave some bits. Maybe you just want the coleslaw. Maybe you just want the bacon bits. Maybe you just want the dismembered hands. Great. That's for you. It's all there. It's a full package, and it has the heart of Stephen King, which everybody, you know, more people and everybody now absolutely adores. We're in another year of endless King adaptations. We won't talk about Firestarter.
No, that's not. It's not. No. But yes, you're correct. We're living through. I want to say now the third big peak of Stephen King adaptations.
Another renaissance, honestly.
Another one. I mean, he's never stopped, but they do seem to coalesce sometimes in kind of split 1 or 2 year periods, bursts almost. Yeah. And you know, we didn't even mention Stephen King's own cameo in It Chapter 2, and a little poking fun of himself as well, where he's like, "Your endings always suck." It's like, okay, King, literally.
Yep. Especially this one.
I know. I mean, yes, I can't believe we've spoken for over an hour and not mentioned the weird
orgy
of the book. But you know, we don't have to, because the films chose not to do it. Good for them. Good for Machete. Yeah. He fixed something that is the one thing that everybody talks about who loves it. It's like, yeah, it is great. Weird child orgy scene, but you know, okay, let's forget about it.
Yep.
The 80s were a hell of a decade.
Strange times. And I think King was on a lot of drugs at one point. So.
Yes. And I think he has spoken about it. He's like, I'm not sure what I was going for there, but okay.
Yeah. Because he does have his moral compass, you know, if you can't feel it in his books, which you obviously can, his action, I mean, when he released obviously the collection of Bachman books, and one of the Bachman books, The Long Walk, is my second favorite under it. But he also had a novella called Rage, which had a school shooter in it, which when Columbine happened, he retracted. You know, he is very active over his work, and he is very, very keen that his work is never real. You know, I think he's, you know, really passionate about that, which I always find really reassuring. Like he's very, for creating such nightmares, he's very, very, he cares and, you know, wants things to stay fictional and, you know, and I think that actually comes through his tone and pure of heart comes through in a lot of his fiction.
And I think it really comes through the characters as well. I think his ability to capture a certain kind of childhood, not tenderness, but what's the word that I'm looking for? The way he captures the Losers Club, the losers in this book and in these films, particularly the first one, they are so vulnerable, but they're so desperate not to show that vulnerability, but we get to see it. We get to see it when they're together, and we get to see it when they're apart, and we get to see them allow themselves to be vulnerable when they find each other. Again, not to go back to the scene of the bloody bathroom, but one of the sweetest moments in the film is when all the losers help Bev clean up the bathroom, because only they can see it, and they don't want her to have to carry that by herself.
Yep.
And at the same time, you know, it's interspersed with beautiful scenes of humor, like the New Kids on the Block joke. It's fantastic.
Love it.
Especially the moment when they go into Ben's room and she sees the poster.
On the back of the door.
And it's a little in joke. It's just chef's kiss. Or, you know, the desperate Richie and to a degree Eddie's as well, just desperate attempt to be more in control of themselves and more independent and more fearless. All their constant swearing and like making sex jokes. It's like, sweetie, Sweetie,
Yeah.
please.
Yeah.
Sweetie, don't.
And there's also the real sweetness of when they've all got their shower caps on because they don't want to get spiders in their hair. Like, and they genuinely have some really sweet chat with these silly hats on. And it's genuinely, like, it's so pure and so lovely, actually, those bits.
And it does feel, I think, at the end of the first film, there's hints, right? You know, so I mentioned this kind of like teenness of it all, the cusp of teenness. And it's very noticeable as well in the scene when they're all at the creek and they're kind of jumping into the water and stuff. The way that the boys are just freaked out by the fact that Bev is there and doing the things that they're doing, I find delightful. Like they're just staring at her like she's some sort of alien because she's a girl. And she's also so effortlessly cool too.
She's
it's
so
like,
cool.
come on, Jesus Christ. Bev in this film at age 12 is like cooler than I am or it will ever be my entire life. But then it's also when everything is done for a bit, it does have that, and King is so good at this, that final summer feeling.
Yes.
The moment where everything has changed and you know it's changed, but you don't know exactly how. And it's either the monster is dead, it's either they have their first kiss, it's either they realize something or they stand up to someone who's been bullying them or you know, in the case of Bev, assaulting them for ages. There's a finality to it. It feels like the beginning of a new point in their lives and in like an entry point, not into adulthood, but into something else, like the death of their childhood.
And I think the monsters that they fight through any King is actually, a lot of them are human, and a lot of them are very, very specific King type characters. The bully Belch is just pure King. The father is as well, you know. And if you think about Mrs. Carmody in The Mist, like these are very. He has very specific types of evil characters that you overcome as well as the horror, which I always really like. It's almost like, oh, that's a King character. And sometimes in both chapter 1 and chapter 2, those characters can be very again, the sort of broad brushstrokes of evil character. Bully is nasty, but also they aren't just cookie cutter because they have an unpredictable edge to them, like the carving into the stomach of Ben, because the other characters are like, what are you doing? Like, this is too far even for us. We know we're bullies, but we don't go that far. And it's those characters that aren't afraid, that are completely immoral, that don't exist in the rules of society, that he is so good at pitting his good characters against.
Beautifully put. And Louise, before we wrap up, is there any last thoughts you wanted to share about the It movies?
I think chapter 2 is far more of a fun, emotional, haunted house than I previously gave it credit for, and I would like to renounce my previous negativity, and I think it's excellent. It has its weak points, certainly, more weak points than the first one, obviously, but it is far stronger than you think it is if you watch it in conjunction with the first. That's my official It statement, Anna.
We're setting the It record straight.
Yes, setting It straight. Yes.
Amazing. Louise, a joy as always.
So lovely.
And also now I know that you reread It every year or every few years, which is very weird and intense, but it makes me appreciate you even more.
Oh, thanks, Anna. And thank you for having me. Again, I have missed you.
Always a pleasure. Form. We should talk about It the book. We should do a Stephen King book club.
Oh my gosh. Like, I literally now want to reread it. I haven't read it for about a year and a half, so it might be time to reread it.
I want to reread it too. I don't think I've reread it since the movies came out, and I sort of dipped into it again. Yeah.
Now is the time.
Now is
especially
the time.
After that rewatch.
Oh dear. But Louise, if people aren't following you already, which they should, where can they find more of your work online?
You can find me mostly on Twitter. I am at shiny_demon, and you'll find all my thoughts on horror movies and games and tech. And also gaming soundtracks. I have a Radio 3 show about gaming soundtracks, so you should listen to that. Sound of Gaming, first Saturday of every month. Also available on BBC Sounds. Thanks for the plug.
Lovely. Thanks so much.